always have to ask where to look. Well, you already know me. This is John Launius. And John, this guy's done so much. It's amazing. We've known each other for a long time. President of Vidzu Media, which is international, right?
Well, we work internationally, yes.
And you do...
We do videos, we do feature films, we do commercials, you name it, we do it.
He does. And also an author. Now, this is really important. Talk about this book, The Life and Times of Missouri's Charles Parsons.
So Charles Parsons was one of the extraordinary figures of the 19th century in St. Louis. He is credited with creating the first art museum west of the Mississippi, which was here in St. Louis, which would set the foundation for the future St. Louis Art Museum, as well as the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University in St. Louis. If you know St. Louis Children's Hospital, it was originally called the Martha Parsons Free Hospital for Children.
Who knew?
When she endowed it, or when he endowed it to his wife, who had passed away in 1889. What's extraordinary about Charles Parsons is that he used banking and finance to really supply St. Louis with so many great things that contributed to the common good.
And if you want to hear, because I don't want to spoil anything, let me tell you, this is the man that could very well be the person responsible for why we finished the Civil War, right?
Right, absolutely. So during the Civil War, Charles Parsons was the general quartermaster in the city of St. Louis. He was best friends with Sherman and Grant, moved their armies. Actually, in the book, there's a secret relationship between he and General Sherman that has been in no other book that we know of. So just really interesting things about St. Louis and its development in the book.
You're going to be amazed. And whether you're from here or you're all the way over in England. Hi, cousins in England and Sweden. I know you're watching this. You got to get the book because the history and how it changed the United States, the world, is amazing. So thank you for doing this work.
Well, Judi, thank you.
And got to listen to the podcast if you want to hear more of the secrets. I am so excited because John Launius, the president of Vidzu Media, part of the Nitrous Effect, and author of The Life and Times of Missouri's Charles Parsons, Between Art and War. First and foremost, talk about what you do with Vidzu.
As the president of Vidzu Media, what we do is that we create amazing stories through pictures. So we've done work for groups like Panera, Centene, Goddard Schools. You've seen our work. We just can't, stamp our logo on our work, but you've seen it. And we work internationally, and we're based here in St. Louis. And the V stands for velocity, Vid stands for video, and Zu, believe it or not, is the Japanese word to tell a story through pictures.
After you're done listening to this podcast, look at some of the links, see the Vidzu links and some of the work that you've done, your company's done. And congratulations, you're now president?
The president, yes.
The president. Sorry. And John and I do go back because when I was doing lipstick and laundry,
yep,
you interviewed us on your podcast.
That's right. Yeah. So Kane, who you may know from Extreme Radio days, when I had gone back to school and was working in different industries, he said, you want to do a podcast. And, I love the radio / podcast medium. Mm-hmm. And so we had a show that was doing very, very well, and we had you guys on.
It was fun. And we were all ahead of our time because now everything's podcast,
yeah,
which I love. I think it's great. It's telling stories, and we're able to really get involved in them. So when did you have time to spend, 9 years in the making with this book?
Yeah, so it was 9 years of research and essentially 1 year of writing. I mean, you and I, obviously, we know each other for years.
Right.
I started in media here in St. Louis in the 90s, and I've had a chance to really work in all forms of media. And what I noticed was that I had never written a book. And so working in media, radio and video, etc. 9 years ago, I said, you know what? I came across Charles Parsons, and I discovered him as an interesting character, really totally influential in St. Louis, but no one had ever told his story.
I just think that's fascinating to me because, as we know, a lot of history is inaccurate, as it is. But when you find out about somebody that's not even in history. And John and I do go back because when I was doing lipstick and laundry,
Yep.
you interviewed us on your podcast.
That's right. Yeah. So Kane, who you may know from Extreme Radio days, when I had gone back to school and was working in different industries, he said, you want to do a podcast. And, I love the radio / podcast medium. And so we had a show that was doing very, very well, and we had you guys on.
It was fun. And we were all ahead of our time because now everything's podcast,
Yeah.
which I love. I think it's great. It's telling stories and we're able to really get involved in them. And I think this kind of a thing, history especially, I know everybody's into the crime stories, which is a part of history, a lot of it, obviously. This to me is way more interesting.
Well, Charles Parsons, again, is one of those interesting characters from the 19th century that high level, he can be credited as being one of the first people to ensure that we had art in St. Louis behind the first art museum west of the Mississippi. If you look at St. Louis Children's Hospital, originally it was called the Martha Parsons Free Hospital for Children when he endowed it in the memory of his wife who passed away in 1889.
Wow.
If you've ever seen the mummies at the St. Louis Art Museum.
My favorite part of the museum.
Those two mummies he purchased in 1896. And what's distinct about that, though, he purchased it for Washington University in St. Louis, but it was with the intention that they would be viewed publicly. And so with Charles Parsons and his group of business leaders, before Charles Parsons, art was really something that the elite held in their homes and you didn't get a chance to see it. But with Charles Parsons and his circle of friends, you begin to see a public commitment to the viewing of art, which would have St. Louis grow culturally. It would have it, you're able to access different cultures. You're having artists coming in from around the world. Harriet Hosmer, who is in the book, who, if you've never seen her work, look up Harriet Hosmer online. Her sculptures are amazing, and there's a number of them here in St. Louis, but Harriet Hosmer was not allowed to train in a medical school on the East Coast. So she came to St. Louis and was trained at what would eventually become Washington University School of Medicine.
Wow.
But Dr. McDowell trained her in anatomy and other distinctions that made her sculptures really come to life. And so she was trained here, but Charles Parsons, again, and his group of friends ensured that she was the first international acclaimed sculptor in the entire world. And so if you look at her work, number one, it's amazing, but her story, which is covered in one of the chapters of the book, is strange, eerie.
Oh, I like this.
But also fascinating because Dr. McDowell was an interesting character. Like, we're not sure how many graves he may have robbed. And we're not sure, one story about Dr. McDowell is that he used to stand on top of his hospital and shoot off cannons and yell at people. Like, so a little bit of a...
little craziness going on there.
Yeah, a little bit. So,
in the name of science, I suppose. Or so he thought.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really it. Now, how did you first come upon learning about Charles Parsons?
Yeah. So since I was 9 years old, I've studied world and Japanese incense traditions, where most of the time when I first say this, people, well, you mean like the 60s and like, covering the smell of whatever? No, actually not. I mean, if we look at every culture from the beginning, from the Sumerians forward, incense is at some point in our culture. It is no longer part of Judaism, but it was originally.
Used to be.
It was.
It's in Catholicism, obviously.
Absolutely. So we see that. And so what's the connection? Well, the pyramid texts tell us that on one level is that as you transform the incense through fire, there's a transformational metaphor that takes place, but the smoke draws your attention upwards. So long story short, I found the subject to be very interesting, along with martial arts, again, when I started studying when I was 9. So fast forward to 2006, when I show up at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, I was hired as a staff member accountable initially for security and training. I had just come from a 5-year journey with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and other intelligence agencies. And when I arrived, my first job was to get the museum open. And the staff there is incredible. And the works at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum are extraordinary. And I invite you right now to go and see the works, because the majority of Charles Parsons' collection is held there today.
Okay, gotcha.
And a lot of it is on display in the permanent collection. So in the spring of 2007, Sabina Ekman, who's the director of the museum, and she is just a wealth of information in the art world, she said, I want to pull out Charles Parsons' collection and look at what we may want to include in future exhibitions. So when that happened, you can imagine 50 objects on a table. Imagine all these paintings. Just all of these works of art from the 19th century. But on the table, there was I'm using air quotes. There was a bowl that from across the room, I said, oh, that's really interesting. That's a Tokugawa incense burner. And so when I walked over to the incense burner, which was labeled as a bowl, I said, that's not a bowl.
Right.
So I went to Sabina and I said, that's not a bowl. And she's German. And she's like, what is it? And
I love it.
And I said, that's a Tokugawa incense burner. And so the Tokugawa ruled Japan from 1603 to essentially 1860.
I was going to say, this had to have been from before 1800 or in the 1800s. This bowl or this incense.
Yeah, so we know that the incense burner was made in the late Edo period because there is some of the iconography relates to a Japanese artist named Hokusai. But the point was that I was like, that's not correct. And so the type A personality that I am needed to correct that. And so she said, write an essay.
Right.
So for about a year, I spent time researching the iconography of the incense burner and writing about that. But along the way, I came into contact with Charles Parsons.
Wow.
And at first, for me, it was like, oh, he's just a guy that, bought a bunch of art. But what started to emerge was this fascinating life story where he had come from New York to St. Louis in the 1840s. Basically, it was like this town is nothing but a bunch of mud and a mule.
Right.
And went then to Keokuk, Iowa, at the recommendation of Page and Bacon. Page and Bacon, who were bankers here in St. Louis. Obviously, you've heard of Page Avenue. So that connect. And so he went to Keokuk, Iowa, which was on its way to becoming bigger than St. Louis.
Wow.
Because at that time, there was no bridge across the Mississippi River in front of St. Louis. The ferry system back and forth across the river, they held all the control of the river.
You're not kidding when you say mules, because it was ferries and mules.
Right, exactly. Right. And basically because the trains weren't allowed to come to St. Louis was finding itself in a bit of decline.
Sure.
But Keokuk, Iowa, who had built a bridge across the river, was beginning to boom. Well, so in 1857, the country experiences one of the first economic depressions that moves us closer to the Civil War. And so Charles Parsons, his bank fails, and he's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? His brother, who had attended Yale and Harvard, was living in St. Louis. He was a lawyer in Alton and was friends with a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
And a number of other people.
Right.
So basically his brother says, well, come to St. Louis. I'll get you introduced to the people that I know. And
I'll introduce you to old Abe,
Right. Well, he ends up marrying into the Pettis family. And so to connect Pettis to today, in 1821, William Grimes Pettis wrote Missouri into the Union in 1821.
Wow, okay.
So Charles Parsons' father-in-law is the man who wrote Missouri into the Union.
Wow.
So now he's pretty much on his way.
Sure.
Well, so the Civil War breaks out, and Charles's brother, his name is Lewis, says, okay, listen, I need somebody that I can trust to, win the war out of St. Louis. And so Charles Parsons becomes the quartermaster of St. Louis and starts to move Grant's and Sherman's armies. And if the actions that Charles Parsons and his brother took had not have happened, there's evidence to suggest that we would have lost the war, because early on in the Civil War, the South continued to win. The Mississippi River was the most important artery that the Union needed to keep control of, because at that time, the majority of movement of troops was, river and rail. And so that needed to be controlled. And that's the reason why this St. Louis became a perfect spot to be able to launch initiatives and also control many of the armaments and arsenals that were here.
So fascinating. And by the way, just so you know, because anybody who knows me, listens to my show, listens to my podcast, has seen me on TV, knows I'm very much into, I call it mindlessness now. Because the only way for me to meditate is to become mindless, not mindful. Yeah. And I'm very much into, we've had lots of talks about incense. And so the fact that you go from John is a very, very intelligent man. I mean, you're working secret kind of stuff with the government. You can't talk about that. But then you're also like, I can say a samurai, but like a scent samurai. I mean, really, it's fascinating to me. And very talented as far as actor and what you do with Vidsu.
Yeah.
And now you're an author. I mean, that just blows my mind.
Thank you.
And do you think that, I'm very much into history with buildings. I go to a building because growing up in Los Angeles, nothing's old.
Right.
So for me to go and touch the building, the last hotel, for example, was the first shoe factory. And they've kept some of the original brick. I'm touching the brick and I'm going, Tennessee Williams touched this brick.
Yeah.
Did you get that feeling when you were did you get to see any of these buildings that Charles Parsons was in, or?
So what's interesting about the Charles Parsons history is that given that we're right around 140 years, since his passing or since he was actually living, a lot of the buildings that he was around are now gone. Now, St. Louis Union Station obviously is still here, but his original house at 2804 Pine is now the generator of some building. Like literally, the generator is exactly on the exact spot where his house used to be.
That's apropos, in my opinion. Think of what he generated.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
The first art museum west of the Mississippi, which was located at 19th and Locust, is now a very just large warehouse.
Wow.
Buildings like Brookings Hall were around when he was around at WashU. And so what became more interesting for me were the historical archives. So something that I've been sharing with people is that, they said, why did it take 9 years for you to find enough information on Charles Parsons? I said, well, first of all, he didn't really seek a lot of fame. He was more occupied with making a difference, what he would call the common good, and moving in that way. So if Google had not have started to digitize historical archives around 2005 and 2006, this book would have never been written. Now, the Missouri Historical Society, they have 57 boxes on Charles Parsons.
Wow.
Because Charles Parsons was a member of the Historical Society, and so all of his papers have been kept. I mean, all that the family gave.
Right.
There's a lot of obviously missing points. But St. Louis Art Museum, they have a lot of information on Parsons because of the mummies. Because most people don't realize that the St. Louis Art Museum used to be called the City Art Museum, and it was originally started by Washington University in St. Louis.
I didn't know that.
And so when the art museum moved from 19th and Locust to Forest Park, Washington University continued to have control to a certain extent until after the 1904 World's Fair. When the 1904 World's Fair occurs, then the city steps in, and then WashU then moves on into other areas, but still having somewhat of a connect to the St. Louis Art Museum. And so, for example, the mummies that we just talked about, they're on permanent loan to the St. Louis Art Museum. Part of that is security, and part of that is also that they have the space to be able to display them.
Sure, exactly. And I highly recommend going and definitely going to, if you haven't even been to the museum yet, the History Museum, you have to go.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much. It takes more than a day.
Well, so the two of them, Pet Menech and also Hennet Wedgaboo. Hennet Wedgaboo is the one you really want to focus on because they're both great. But Hennet Wedgaboo, believe it or not, is actually the most rare mummy outside of Egypt.
Wow.
Of her particular status. So she was a singer to the god Amun, and her coffin is gilded.
Wow.
And so only coffins of royalty were gilded. But she's not royalty, but her coffin is gilded.
Interesting.
And so you can also see other body parts that are showing that make it extraordinary. And people miss this, but it truly is one of the most extraordinary mummies outside of Egypt.
Wow. And it's right here, just right in our own backyard.
Absolutely.
And if you're not here listening, because we're all over the world, it's definitely one very good reason to come here and check it out in St. Louis. So where do we get this book? Where is it available? And you're doing a book signing coming up? Yeah, so there's a number of book signings coming up. So to answer your first question, the book is available internationally. Right. So if you go to Amazon, obviously you can find it. My request is that you support your local
bookseller. So you can do that if you're in St. Louis and anywhere in the world. You just go to your favorite bookseller and say, hey, I want The Life and Times of Missouri's Charles Parsons, Between Art and War, and then they will either order it or they may already have it. What's interesting about this subject is that even though it says Missouri and it focuses on St. Louis, this book is selling internationally because of the topics of the mummies, because of the art, because of Washington University, because of the St. Louis Art Museum. All of these particular subjects, artists like Corot, Church, Gifford, and Innes of the 19th century that Parsons collected. There's people all over the planet that are finding a connect. And the reason why that I'm sharing that is because I love that in the 19th century, St. Louis was called the Fourth City.
Wow.
And it was a city that literally Germans and all nationalities were passing through to develop and grow in the Midwest. And if it would not have been for trains and it would not have been for the Civil War, St. Louis would be in a much different place than what it is now.
But people like you are bringing us together again. I mean,
I hope
you
so.
Take the internet. That's the good part of the internet.
Yeah.
Is it really does bring people together. Now let's bring them to experience it. I would say even go further. And yes, you want your bookstores local, but I'd say go to the museum when you're here and get your book at the museum.
Absolutely.
That would be the best thing to do.
Yeah. And also the Missouri Historical Society, because sometimes people think that, I can't get access to the Missouri Historical Society because I'm not a member.
I didn't think I could until I saw an interview with you.
Yeah, well, you can. I mean, it's completely free and available, and you can go right now to the library and make requests. And they're great. I mean, I have photos that are over 150 years old that they have digitized for me. Obviously, you're going to pay a little bit for that, but totally worth it.
Oh yeah,
and the support that I've received from the St. Louis Art Museum, the Missouri Historical Society, the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. I mean, there's probably about 50 acknowledgments in this book. I was saying earlier today, I was giving a lecture and I was talking about how even though my name is on the book, there's about 50 people in the acknowledgments that also contributed to this book.
It took a team.
Yeah, and I'm just grateful for that.
St. Louis is more than baseball. We're more than hockey. We have such a deep cultural art background and history.
Yeah.
So
well, that's another point that I'm glad you're bringing up, is that what I also love about Parsons and the story of St. Louis is that Parsons landed on the right side of history. What I mean by that is that he was a St. Louis businessman who used his wealth for the common good of everyone. And I really want to point that out. Like, a lot of awful things happened in the 19th century, but Charles Parsons ensured that all people would find value. And that's, for me, the most important message about Charles, is saying that, sometimes people think, the Midwest is maybe a little backwards if you're from the coasts. Not at all. And I think that stereotype serves people on the coast. But, it's extraordinary to me, the people that I've met in St. Louis, that whether it's a discussion of the 19th century or what's happening in the 21st century, the difference that we're making for people is pretty extraordinary.
Coming up, you have events.
So February 26th, we're doing a book signing at Subterranean Books. That's at 7 p.m. If you can't make that one, March 4th, we're going to be at Left Bank Books at 7 p.m. If you can't make that one, there is March 14th, which is at the Bell Fountain Cemetery and Arboretum, and I want to just touch on this one a little bit. So Bell Fountain Cemetery is where Charles Parsons was interred.
Wow.
And his cenotaph is extraordinary, but we're going to give a lecture, and I'm going to speak about Japanese incense specifically.
Oh, that'll be a great one.
Inside the chapel. And so it's pretty extraordinary. It's beautiful, first of all, but each signing or talk is going to be unique, so you could literally attend all of them, because again, the subject with Charles Parsons and this book is so wide and diverse that you're able to do that. And then March 21st, we're going to be at Art St. Louis. So it's pretty easy. If you just go to Facebook and just look up at Parsons Book, then that way you can see all the events.
And I will share all the links, Instagram, Twitter, parsonsbook.com. I will share all that for you and for you as you're listening to this. And I will definitely I'd love to be at all of them.
I would love to have you there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Judy, thank you.
Congratulations. We're going to probably have you back when you have spare time to do a whole nother episode of the podcast on the incense, because it's such an important thing. So
Chapter 9 in the book covers a lot of that.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm still going to make you come back.
I love that.
John, thank you again.
Thank you.
Justified.